It only took 8 minutes, a few shouts, a single volley of musket fire to spark the longest war in American history. But behind those 8 minutes were years of arguments, fear, courage, and quiet resolve. It's 5 a.m. on a cold April morning in 1775. 7 ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and blacksmiths stand on a patch of grass in Lexington, Massachusetts, clutching their muskets with trembling hands. Across from them, 700 of the world's most feared soldiers, British Redcoats in perfect formation. What happens next takes just 8 minutes, but those 8 minutes, they'll trigger the longest war in American history and change the world forever. Welcome back to Liberty Unfolded, where we dive deep into the moments that shaped America. I'm your host, and today we're talking about the Battle of Lexington, 8 minutes that literally started a revolution. But here's what your textbooks didn't tell you. This wasn't just about tea taxes or stamps. This was about ordinary people making an impossible choice when freedom hung in the balance. Hit that like button if you're ready to discover the real story behind the shot heard round the world. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of American liberty. On April 19th, 1775, at 5 a.m. morning, and the Massachusetts countryside is shrouded in pre-dawn darkness. The temperature hovers around 46 degrees and a light mist clings to the ground. On Lexington Green, really just a triangular patch of grass in the center of town, 77 colonial militia stand in an uneven line, their breath visible in the cold air. These aren't professional soldiers. Look at their faces and you'll see John Robbins, a 19-year-old farmer's son who's never been more than 10 miles from home. There's Jedediah Monroe, a 65-year-old grandfather whose arthritis makes it hard to hold his musket steady. Most of these men have known each other their entire lives. They've shared harvests, helped raise each other's barns, and prayed in the same church every Sunday. Across from them, emerging from the morning mist like something out of a nightmare, come 700 British regulars. These are the most feared soldiers in the world, men who have fought in Europe, the Caribbean, and India. They move with mechanical precision, their scarlet uniforms immaculate, their bayonets fixed and gleaming. The sound of their synchronized marching echoes off the surrounding houses, where terrified families peer through shuttered windows. The contrast is staggering. The colonists wear homespun clothes, carry hunting rifles alongside military muskets, and some don't even have proper ammunition. Many had been drinking at Buckman Tavern just hours before, trying to calm their nerves. The British, meanwhile, represent the military might of an empire that spans the globe. But here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. These 77 ordinary Americans chose to be there. They didn't have to stand on that green. They could have stayed home, hidden in their cellars, pretended to be sick. Instead, they answered the call when the church bells rang out in the darkness, when riders galloped through town shouting warnings. Among them stands Solomon Pierce, a 34-year-old blacksmith whose calloused hands shake as he grips his musket. He's thinking about his wife Hannah and their 3 young children, still asleep in their beds just 200 yards away. Pierce knows he might not see them again, but he also knows that if he doesn't stand now, they might never be truly free. The British column is led by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, a career officer who's served His Majesty for over 30 years. Smith is tired. They've been marching since midnight and increasingly worried. The countryside seems to be awakening around them. Church bells ring in the distance, signal fires burn on hilltops, and armed men shadow their movements from the woods. Major John Pitcairn, Smith's seconding command, rides ahead with the advance guard. Pitcairn is actually sympathetic to the colonists' grievances. He's written letters home criticizing British policy. But he's also a soldier, and he has his orders. As he approaches the green, he can see the tension in his men's faces. They're exhausted, nervous, and far from home. The moment crystallizes everything that's been building for a decade. This isn't just about taxes anymore, it's about whether free people can govern themselves or whether they'll forever be subjects of a distant king. The men on both sides sense that something irreversible is about to happen. What makes this confrontation so remarkable is that both sides initially tried to avoid it. The British wanted to complete their mission quietly. The colonists wanted to make a statement without starting a war. But sometimes history has its own momentum, and on this cold April morning, 77 Americans and 700 British soldiers are about to collide in a way that will echo through eternity. Let me tell you about the most important decision in American history, one made by a man who knew he was dying. Captain John Parker stands 5 feet 8 inches tall, with graying hair and eyes that have seen too much. At 45, he's already lived longer than most men of his era, but tuberculosis is slowly killing him. He coughs up blood regularly, and his wife Lydia begs him to stay home this morning, but Parker has made a choice that will define America forever. Parker isn't some wealthy plantation owner or educated lawyer. He's a farmer and mechanic, a man who works with his hands and speaks plainly. Born in Lexington, he's never lived anywhere else. This green where he now stands, he played here as a child, courted his wife here, brought his own children here to play. Every building, every face, every stone wall holds memories. 15 years earlier, Parker fought in the French and Indian War under British command. He was at the siege of Louisburg, where he watched good men die in the mud for King George. He believed in the cause, then defending British territory, protecting British subjects. But something fundamental has changed. The same government he once served now treats him and his neighbors like criminals. Here's what most people don't understand about Parker's situation. He's not just making a military decision, he's making a moral one. As captain of the Lexington Militia, he's responsible for every man under his command. These aren't strangers, they're his neighbors, his friends, his relatives. Young Timothy Monroe is his nephew. A Sahol porter helped him build his barn last summer. Jonas Parker is his own cousin. The night before, Parker met with other militia leaders at Buckman Tavern. They knew the British were coming, but they debated what to do. Some wanted to hide in the woods and harass the column as it passed. Others suggested simply staying home. Why provoke a fight they couldn't win? Parker listened to every argument, then made his choice. They would assemble on the green and make their stand in the open, like free men. But Parker's decision goes deeper than tactics. He's dying, and he knows it. The tuberculosis that's consuming his lungs gives him perhaps 6 months to live. He could spend that time quietly with his family, tending his farm, watching his children grow. Instead, he chooses to risk everything for a principle, that Americans should govern themselves. The weight of command sits heavily on Parker's shoulders as he watches the British column approach. He's not a natural orator like Samuel Adams or a brilliant strategist like George Washington. He's just a practical man who's reached his limit. When his militia gathers in the Preed, on darkness, some of them are scared teenagers, others are grandfathers. They trust him to make the right choice. Parker's famous words stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Weren't delivered as a rousing speech. They were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, to the men around him. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was trying to salvage his community's honor while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. The irony is profound. Parker, who spent years fighting for the British Empire, now stands ready to die opposing it. The same courage that made him a good British soldier now makes him a dangerous rebel. He understands that some principles are worth dying for, especially when you're dying already. As the British advance guard approaches, Parker faces the hardest choice of his life. He could order his men to disperse and no one would blame him. They're outnumbered 10-1 and retreat would save lives. But Parker also knows that if they back down now, they'll never get another chance to stand as free men. In his final moments of decision, Parker embodies everything that makes America different. He's not a nobleman or a professional soldier. He's an ordinary man who's decided that ordinary people deserve extraordinary freedom. When the shooting starts, Parker will stand his ground until the end, even as his men fall around him. He survives the battle but dies 5 months later, never knowing that his impossible choice on Lexington Green would birth a nation. 5:15 a.m. The two forces face each other across Lexington Green in a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Major John Pitcairn, mounted on his horse, raises his sword and shouts across the morning air, "Disperse, ye rebels, damn you, disperse." His voice carries clearly in the still air, and some of the militia begin to drift away from their line. But then it happens. A single musket shot cracks through the dawn, and in that instant everything changes forever. The sound echoes off the surrounding houses, and for a split second, both sides freeze. Then hell breaks loose. Here's the thing that will blow your mind. To this day, nobody knows who fired that shot. Not the British, not the Americans, not historians who have studied this moment for 250 years. It's the most important gunshot in American history, and it's a complete mystery. The British later claimed that the shot came from behind a stone wall, fired by a hidden colonial sniper. Lieutenant Edward Good of the 4th Regiment of Foot swore he saw a fellow fire a gun from the corner of a house, but when investigators looked, they found no evidence of anyone hiding there. Captain Pitcairn himself wrote in his official report that he was certain the colonists fired first, but he couldn't identify the shooter. The Americans told a completely different story. Private Sylvanus Wood, who was there that morning, swore under oath that the shot came from a British soldier who had broken ranks. Wood claimed he saw the muzzle flash from the British line. Thomas Fessenden, another militia member, testified that he saw a British officer fire a pistol into the air before the shooting started. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some witnesses claimed the shot didn't come from either line. They said it came from Buckman Tavern, where some militia members were still drinking. Others insisted it came from the woods, possibly from a nervous sentry who accidentally discharged his weapon. The most likely explanation: it was an accidental discharge. Picture this: you're an 18-year-old farm boy, you've never been in a military confrontation. You're holding a musket with a sensitive trigger, and you're absolutely terrified. Your hands are shaking, your heart is pounding, and suddenly you're faced with the most feared army in the world. In that moment of extreme tension, it would be easy for someone's finger to slip on the trigger. But whether it was accidental or intentional, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The moment that shot rang out, the British line erupted in what military historians call sympathetic fire. When nervous soldiers hear shooting and immediately begin firing themselves without orders. Captain Pitcairn, the British officer in charge, was actually trying to prevent violence. Contemporary accounts describe him shouting desperately at his men to stop firing, waving his sword in the air, even spurring his horse in front of the British line to block their shots. But it was too late. The sound of that first shot had triggered something primal in his soldiers' months of tension, fear, and exhaustion exploded in 8 minutes of violence. What makes this moment so tragic is that both sides were trying to avoid a fight. Parker had ordered his men not to fire unless fired upon. Pitcairn had explicit orders to avoid confrontation. But in that split second when the mystery shot rang out, control was lost forever. The irony is staggering. The shot that started the American Revolution might have been fired by someone who never intended to start anything. It could have been a nervous teenager, a drunk militiaman, or even a British regular who was as scared as everyone else. The most important moment in American history might have been a complete accident. Ralph Waldo Emerson later immortalized this moment in his 1837 poem Concord Hymn. calling it the shot heard round the world. But Emerson was writing 62 years after the fact, and even he didn't know who fired it. The mystery of that shot has become part of American mythology, the idea that sometimes history pivots on moments so small, so random, that we can never fully understand them. But here's what we do know. In the chaos that followed, 8 Americans died on Lexington Green, and the British Empire lost 13 colonies. One unknown person, with one squeeze of a trigger, changed the course of human history. It's a reminder that each of us carries the power to shape the future, even when we don't realize it. 8 men died on Lexington Green that morning, and their stories will break your heart and inspire your soul. These weren't professional soldiers or political leaders, they were neighbors, fathers, sons, and brothers who made the ultimate sacrifice for an idea that didn't even have a name yet. Let's start with Jonathan Harrington Jr., 30 years old, a farmer and father of 2 young children. When the British volley tore through the militia line, Harrington was hit in the chest. But here's the part that still gives me chills. Mortally wounded, bleeding from a hole in his lung, Harrington crawled 100 yards across Lexington Green to die at the doorstep of his own home. His wife Ruth and their children, a 6-year-old daughter and 4-year-old son, watched in horror as their husband and father used his last breath to come home to them. Think about that for a moment. Harrington could have died where he fell, but something drove him to crawl across that green. Maybe he wanted to tell his family he loved them one last time. Maybe he wanted to die in familiar surroundings rather than on cold grass. Or maybe he wanted to show his children that even in death, an American comes home on his own terms. Then there's Jonas Parker, Captain John Parker's own cousin. At 61, Jonas was one of the older militia members, a man who'd lived through the French and Indian War and raised a family in Lexington. When the shooting started, Jonas stood his ground even as younger men fled. A British bayonet pierced his chest, and he died where he stood, his musket still in his hands. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "It's a good cause to die for." Robert Munro, 26 years old, was a newlywed. He'd married his sweetheart Anna just 8 months earlier, and they were expecting their first child. Munro had everything to live for, but when the call came to muster on the green, he kissed his pregnant wife goodbye and picked up his musket. The British volley cut him down instantly. His son was born 3 months later and grew up knowing his father died for American liberty. Samuel Hadley, 32, was a shoemaker who'd spent the previous day crafting boots for his neighbors. He had steady hands and a quiet demeanor, the kind of man who fixed problems rather than complaining about them. When the British shot him through the heart, he fell backward onto the green he'd crossed thousands of times as a child. His workshop stood empty for months afterward, his unfinished boots still sitting on the workbench. Isaac Muzzy, 25, was the town's part-time barber and full-time dreamer. He'd been talking for months about moving west to find better farmland, maybe starting fresh in New York or Pennsylvania. His friends joked that Isaac was always planning his next adventure. The British musket ball that killed him ended all those dreams, but it also ensured that future generations would have the freedom to chase their own. Asahel Porter, 23, was the youngest to die that morning. He'd been married just 6 months to a girl named Thankful, and they'd been planning to start a family. Porter was known for his quick wit and infectious laugh, the kind of young man who made everyone around him feel better. When the shooting started, Porter was reloading his musket when a British bullet found him. He died clutching the ramrod, trying to get off one more shot for liberty. Caleb Harrington, 39, was Jonathan's older brother. The two had farmed side by side their entire lives, shared tools, helped each other with harvests, and raised their children together. When Caleb saw his younger brother fall, he ran to help him, only to be shot down himself. The Harrington family lost 2 fathers that morning, leaving 4 children orphaned and 2 widows to face an uncertain future. Finally, there's Nathaniel Wyman, 60, a grandfather who'd survived smallpox, Indian raids, and brutal winters. Wyman had lived through enough history to know that some things were worth dying for. When the British demanded that the militia disperse, Wyman reportedly said, "I'm too old to run and too proud to hide." He died standing upright, his musket aimed at the British line. Here's what makes these 8 deaths so profound. None of these men had to be there. They weren't drafted, conscripted, or forced to fight. They chose to stand on Lexington Green because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed their children deserved to grow up free, even if they wouldn't live to see it. The British soldiers who killed them weren't monsters. They were following orders, serving their king, doing what they'd been trained to do. But in those 8 minutes, they accidentally created 8 martyrs whose deaths would inspire a continent to revolution. These 8 men didn't die for independence. That concept wouldn't be formally declared for another year. They died for the principle that free people should govern themselves, that ordinary citizens have the right to say no to tyranny, and that liberty is worth any sacrifice. Their graves in Lexington Cemetery bear a simple inscription: "They fought and died for liberty." But their real monument isn't made of stone, it's the America they made possible with their blood. After the bloodshed at Lexington, the British column reforms and marches toward Concord, their original destination. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, the British commander, thinks he's put down a local disturbance. He has no idea that he's just lit a fuse that will explode across Massachusetts and eventually the entire continent. The 16-mile march from Lexington to Concord should have been routine for professional soldiers. But as the Redcoats advance, something extraordinary happens. The countryside comes alive around them. Church bells ring from every village. Signal fires blaze on hilltops. Riders gallop along country roads, spreading word of the massacre at Lexington. By the time the British reach Concord at 8 a.m., they're walking into a trap. Here's what makes this moment so remarkable. There was no central command, no coordinated plan, no military hierarchy giving orders. Instead, hundreds of ordinary Americans simply decided independently to fight back. They grabbed their muskets, kissed their families goodbye, and ran toward the sound of gunfire. In Concord, the British accomplish part of their mission. They find some hidden weapons and supplies, destroy what they can, and capture a few cannon. But they also discover something that terrifies them. The colonial militia is growing by the hour. What started as 77 men at Lexington has become hundreds, then thousands, of armed Americans converging on Concord. The real fighting begins at Concord's North Bridge. Major John Buttrick, a local militia commander, watches from a hill as smoke rises from the town center. Thinking the British are burning houses, they're actually just destroying supplies. Buttrick makes a decision that changes everything. He turns to his men and says, "Will you let them burn the town down?" The answer is a resounding no. What follows is the first time in the Revolution that Americans advance on British regulars with the intent to kill. At Lexington, the colonists had been caught off guard, dispersing when the shooting started. But at North Bridge, they attack in formation with deadly purpose. The British, suddenly facing disciplined fire from multiple directions, break and run. But the real nightmare for the British begins on the road back to Boston. This is where the revolution truly starts, not with a formal declaration or a political speech, but with farmers and shopkeepers turning their countryside into a battlefield. The retreat becomes a 16-mile running battle unlike anything in European military experience. The Americans don't fight like European armies, standing in neat lines and firing volleys. Instead, they use tactics learned from fighting Indians hiding behind stone walls, trees, and buildings, picking off British soldiers one by one, then disappearing into the woods. Take the story of Samuel Whittemore, 78 years old and the oldest American to fight that day. Whittemore was a farmer in Menotomy, now Arlington, who'd fought in King George's War and the French and Indian War. When he heard the British were retreating, he grabbed his musket, 2 pistols, and a sword. Positioning himself behind a stone wall, Whittemore killed 3 British soldiers and wounded several others before they overwhelmed him. The British shot Whittemore in the face, bayoneted him multiple times, and left him for dead in a pool of blood. But when neighbors found him hours later, he was still alive, trying to reload his musket. He recovered from his wounds and lived another 18 years, becoming a local legend. When people asked him why he fought, Whittemore would say, "I wanted to show those young men how an old soldier fights." The British retreat turns into a nightmare of constant harassment. At every bend in the road, Americans appear from behind trees and walls, fire, and vanish. The Redcoats are exhausted, running low on ammunition, and completely demoralized. They're used to fighting European armies that follow the rules of warfare, not an entire civilian population that treats every stone wall as a fortress. By the time reinforcements reach the retreating column at Lexington, the British have lost all semblance of military order. They're running, not marching, and their officers struggle to maintain any control. The reinforcements help, but the harassment continues all the way to Charlestown, where the British finally reach the safety of their ships. The statistics tell the story. The British lose 273 men killed, wounded, or missing. The Americans lose fewer than 100, but more importantly, something fundamental has changed. The most powerful army in the world has been bloodied by farmers and shopkeepers. The myth of British invincibility dies on the road from Concord. Word of the day's events spreads like wildfire across the colonies. In Philadelphia, New York, and Virginia, people read accounts of ordinary Americans standing up to professional soldiers and winning. The psychological effect is enormous if Massachusetts farmers can fight the British Empire. Maybe independence isn't impossible after all. But perhaps most importantly, the events of April 19th prove that Americans will fight for their principles. This wasn't a mob or a riot, it was a coordinated, sustained military action by civilians who chose to risk everything for liberty. The 8 minutes at Lexington had awakened something that would never go back to sleep. Now, let's talk about some people history forgot the men who had to turn 8 minutes of violence into 8 years of war. When news of Lexington and Concord reaches Philadelphia on April 24, 1775, the Second Continental Congress is meeting in Carpenter's Hall. These aren't firebrands or revolutionaries, they're businessmen, lawyers, farmers, and merchants. Most of them still hope for reconciliation with Britain. But there's a guy named John Adams from Massachusetts who understands what's at stake. Adams is 39 years old, short and stocky, with a temper that gets him in trouble and a brilliance that makes him indispensable. People call him obnoxious and disliked, but Adams sees the bigger picture. He knows that what happened at Lexington wasn't just a skirmish, it was a point of no return. In his letters to his wife Abigail, Adams writes about the die being cast and the Rubicon being crossed. He's terrified but determined. Adams understands that the colonists now face a choice: submit to British authority or fight for independence. There's no middle ground left. Then there's John Hancock, the guy with the famous signature. Hancock was supposed to be arrested by the British at Lexington. He and Samuel Adams had been staying at the Hancock Clark House in Lexington the night before the battle. They escaped just hours before the British arrived. Hancock is rich. He's got everything to lose, but he throws his fortune behind the revolution. When he later signs the Declaration of Independence, he makes his signature huge and says, "There, I guess King George can read that without his spectacles." But it's the lesser known delegates whose stories really capture the magnitude of what's happening. Take Dr. Benjamin Rush from Pennsylvania, a 29-year-old physician who's never been in politics before. Rush is horrified by the news from Massachusetts, but he's also inspired. He begins writing pamphlets arguing that America has a moral duty to break free from British tyranny. His words help convince ordinary colonists that independence isn't just possible, it's necessary. Then there's Caesar Rodney from Delaware, a man literally dying of cancer whose face is so disfigured by tumors that he wears a green silk scarf to cover half of it. Rodney will later ride 80 miles through a thunderstorm to cast the deciding vote for independence, knowing that the effort might kill him. When asked why he risks everything, Rodney says simply, "Liberty is worth any sacrifice." The Congress faces an impossible decision. They can try to negotiate with Britain, hoping to avoid war, but the blood at Lexington makes compromise seem like betrayal. They can declare independence, but that means certain war against the world's most powerful empire. Or they can do nothing and watch as Massachusetts burns. The debates are agonizing. Conservative delegates like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania argue for one last attempt at reconciliation. "We have not yet given Great Britain a proper opportunity to respond to our grievances," Dickinson pleads. But radical delegates like Samuel Adams counter that the time for talk is over. The die is cast. Adams argues, "We must fight or submit." The psychological pressure is enormous. These men know that if they choose war and lose, they'll be hanged as traitors. Their families will be destroyed, their property confiscated, their names cursed by history. But if they choose submission, they'll have betrayed everything they claim to believe about liberty and self-governance. The turning point comes when George Washington, a Virginia planter who said almost nothing during the debates, stands up and addresses the Congress. Washington is 43 years old, tall and imposing, with a presence that commands respect. He's also a veteran of the French and Indian War who understands the cost of armed conflict better than most. "Gentlemen," Washington says in his quiet, measured voice, "we can no longer avoid the question that faces us. The people of Massachusetts have already chosen. They have chosen to fight rather than submit. The question now is whether we will abandon them to face the British Empire alone, or whether we will stand with them as Americans. The vote to create the Continental Army passes by a narrow margin, and Washington is unanimously chosen as its commander. He accepts the position with visible reluctance, knowing that he's signing up for years of hardship and possible death." In his acceptance speech, Washington refuses to take any salary, asking only that Congress cover his expenses. But perhaps the most telling moment comes when John Adams writes to his wife Abigail about the decision. "I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration," he writes, "but through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is worth more than all the means." These men weren't warriors or revolutionaries by nature. They were practical people who'd been pushed to an impossible choice. The 8 minutes at Lexington had forced them to decide. Would they remain British subjects or become American citizens? There was no middle ground left, and they chose freedom. What happened next will amaze you. Those 8 minutes at Lexington triggered 8 years of war, the longest conflict in American history until Vietnam. Think about that for a moment. A brief skirmish on a village green in Massachusetts evolved into a global war that redrew the map of the world. The numbers are staggering. Between 1775 and 1783, approximately 25,000 Americans died in the Revolutionary War. That's more than 3,000 deaths for every minute of the original battle at Lexington. The war consumed an entire generation, destroyed families, bankrupted the colonial economy, and turned neighbors into enemies. But here's what makes this transformation so remarkable. The war wasn't fought by professional armies alone. It was fought by ordinary people who kept the dream of liberty alive through 8 years of unimaginable hardship. Consider the story of Joseph Plum Martin, who enlisted in the Continental Army at age 15 and served for the entire war. Martin's memoir describes marching barefoot through snow. eating bark and grass when food ran out, and watching friends die not from British bullets but from disease and starvation. At Valley Forge, Martin wrote, "We were not only starved but frozen. I have seen men's feet literally rotted off from the cold." Yet Martin and thousands like him kept fighting. When asked why, he wrote, "We were fighting for our liberty, our independence, our very existence as free people. That was worth any sacrifice." The war's scope expanded far beyond what anyone imagined that April morning. By 1778, France had joined the Americans, turning a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Spain entered the war in 1779, followed by the Netherlands in 1780. Britain found itself fighting enemies on multiple continents from the Caribbean to India to the Mediterranean. But it was the American home front that truly showcased the revolutionary spirit born at Lexington. Take Deborah Sampson, a Massachusetts woman who disguised herself as a man and fought in the Continental Army for over a year. Sampson was wounded twice and nearly died of fever, but she kept her identity secret because she believed in the cause. When finally discovered, she was honorably discharged and her story became legend, or consider the sacrifice of ordinary families. Abigail Adams managed the family farm and business while her husband John spent years in Philadelphia and Europe. She educated their children, dealt with wartime shortages, and endured constant fear that her husband might be captured and executed as a traitor. In her letters, she wrote, "I am more convinced than ever that it is better to die free than live in slavery." The war's economic cost was devastating. The Continental Congress printed money to fund the war, leading to massive inflation. By 1779, continental currency was so worthless that people said something was not worth a continental. Families lost their life savings, farms were abandoned, and entire communities were destroyed. But perhaps most tragically, the war divided families and communities. Roughly 1/3 of Americans remained loyal to Britain, creating a civil war within the Revolution. Brothers fought brothers, fathers disowned sons, and lifelong friendships shattered over politics. The loyalists who sided with Britain lost everything, their property was confiscated, their families were ostracized, and many were forced to flee to Canada or Britain. The turning point came at Yorktown in 1781, where British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered his entire army to George Washington. The symbolism was profound. The same British military machine that had seemed invincible at Lexington was now beaten by the Americans they had once dismissed as rabble. But even victory came at enormous cost. The new nation was $75 million in debt, had no functioning government, and faced the daunting task of building a democracy from scratch. Many of the men who stood at Lexington didn't live to see independence. Captain John Parker died of tuberculosis in September 1775, just 5 months after the battle. Yet their sacrifice created something unprecedented in human history. A nation founded on the principle that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. The 8 minutes at Lexington had become 8 years of war, which became 250 years of American liberty. The most profound legacy of that long war wasn't military victory. It was the proof that ordinary people could govern themselves. The farmers and shopkeepers who fought at Lexington and Concord went on to create the Constitution, establish the Bill of Rights, and build the foundations of modern democracy. They proved that you don't need to be born into nobility to deserve freedom. When the last British ship sailed from New York Harbor in 1783, it carried with it not just defeated soldiers, but an entire world view. The idea that kings ruled by divine right, that common people couldn't be trusted with power, that liberty was a privilege for the few, all of these concepts died during those 8 years of war. The cost had been enormous, but so had the achievement. The 8 minutes at Lexington had sparked a revolution that didn't just create a new nation, It created a new understanding of human rights and dignity that would inspire liberation movements around the world for centuries to come. The 8-minute battle that started the longest war in American history. So what can we learn from those 8 minutes in Lexington? First, that freedom isn't free. It requires ordinary people to make extraordinary choices. Captain John Parker and his militia didn't set out to start a war, but when the moment came, they chose to stand up rather than back down. Second, that change often begins with a single act of defiance. One shot fired by someone we'll never know changed the course of human history. It reminds us that we all have the power to make history, even if we don't realize it at the time. And finally, that the liberty we enjoy today was paid for by people who had everything to lose and chose to risk it anyway. From the 77 militia on Lexington Green to the delegates who signed the Declaration of Independence, knowing they were signing their own death warrants if they lost. The next time you vote, speak your mind, or exercise any of your constitutional rights, remember that it all started with 8 minutes on a cold April morning in 1775. 8 minutes when ordinary Americans chose freedom over security, resistance over submission. If this story of American courage inspired you, smash that like button and subscribe to Liberty Unfolded for more untold stories of how ordinary people built extraordinary freedom. And here's a question for you. What moment in your life required you to choose between what was easy and what was right? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Remember, liberty isn't just our inheritance, it's our responsibility. Until next time, keep unfolding the truth. Subscribe for more stories of American liberty.